Don't you dare shout at me. The words, spoken low and steady, cut through the controlled chaos of the emergency ward. For a moment, the frantic world of beeping machines and strained voices seemed to pause, holding its breath. This was the night the storm came to Mercy General Hospital. This was the night a nurse, defined by a past she refused to let break her, stood her ground against a man who broke the world to his will. This was no fairy tale. This was a gritty, city story where the monster was a very real Korean mafia boss, and his castle was a penthouse suite overlooking a city that trembled at his name. And the beauty? She was no damsel in distress. She was a warrior in scrubs, armed not with a sword, but with a quiet, unyielding sense of right and wrong that would prove to be the most dangerous weapon of all. Could a woman dedicated to healing truly mend a soul forged in violence? Their story began here, in the harsh fluorescent glare of the ER, with a challenge that would either ignite an impossible fire or burn everything to the ground. Isabel Rossi moved through the emergency room with a practiced calm that soothed everyone around her. She was a comforting presence in the middle of a storm. Tonight, a massive pileup on the freeway had flooded the hospital with the broken and the bleeding. Isabel was in her element, titrating a dopamine drip with an expert touch, her voice a low murmur of reassurance to the frightened young man on the gurney, all while mentally planning her next 3 moves. It was then that the main doors burst open, not with the usual rush of paramedics, but with an aura of cold, oppressive power that seemed to suck the very air from the room. 2 large men in perfectly tailored black suits flanked a third man. He was the center of their universe, the dark sun they orbited. He was tall and powerfully built, his handsome face a mask of controlled pain. He wore an expensive black mafia suit over a crisp white collared shirt, now stained with blood from a makeshift bandage on his left arm. The man in the center, the feared Korean mafia boss Kang Dae-hyun, spoke, his voice a low growl that demanded obedience. "I need a surgeon." Now, it wasn't a request. It was an order to a world that had long learned to obey him. A nervous young doctor hurried forward, but Dae-hyun's stormy gaze swept right past him and landed on Isabel. He pointed a finger, a gesture of pure, undiluted arrogance. "You! Stop what you're doing. Take me to a private room and get me Dr. Samuel Carter." Isabel didn't even flinch. She finished securing the 4-line for her patient, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She gave the young man's hand a reassuring squeeze before finally turning to face the storm. She met Dae-hyun's gaze, her own dark eyes clear and unwavering. "There are rules here, sir. You'll be seen in order of how serious your injury is, just like everyone else. And you will lower your voice." This is a hospital, a vein throbbed in Dae-hyun's temple. The sheer nerve of her defiance was something he hadn't faced in years. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he snarled, taking a step forward, his immense presence meant to intimidate and crush anyone in his path. That was when she said it. The words that changed everything. "I don't care who you are," she said, her voice dropping but gaining an impossible strength. "In my hospital, you are a patient. And you will not speak to me or anyone else like that. Don't you dare shout at me." The silence that followed was deafening. Dae-hyun's right-hand man, a stone-faced man named Park Jin-woo, tensed, ready for a command to remove this woman. The entire ER staff froze, a collective picture of shock and fear. They all knew power when they saw it, and the man bleeding in their midst radiated it like a dark star. But Isabel Rossi just stood there, her chin held high, the quiet strength in her posture like an unbreakable wall. A slow, dangerous smile touched Dae-hyun's lips, a chilling expression that held no warmth at all. It was the look of a predator who had just discovered a fascinating, inexplicably fearless new creature in his territory. Before he could speak, Dr. Samuel Carter, the hospital's chief of surgery and Isabel's mentor, appeared. He took in the tense scene with a quick, knowing glance. "Mr. Kang," he said, his calm voice a welcome relief. "I was told you were on your way. Let's get you to the executive suite. Isabel, if you would please assist us." The command created a fragile peace. Dae-hyun's intense stare lingered on Isabel for a moment longer before he gave a short nod and allowed Dr. Carter to lead him away. As the group disappeared down the hall, the ER seemed to let out a collective sigh. Chloe, Isabel's best friend and fellow nurse, rushed to her side, her eyes wide. "Are you out of your mind?" she whispered, a grin spreading across her face. "You just told off a man who probably has his own private cemetery." "I think I'm in love with you." Isabel let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline finally starting to fade. "He's just a man, Chloe." A rude one who showed up with his own personal army, Chloe countered. Just then, Dr. Marcus Reed, a surgeon whose ego was much bigger than his talent, swaggered over. "Rossi," he snapped, his face pinched with disapproval. "What was that all about?" "We have a duty to our hospital's biggest donors. You don't speak to men like Mr. King that way." "It's reckless." Isabel's spine stiffened again. "My duty is to my patients, Dr. Reed. All of them. Not just the wealthy ones who think they can buy their way to the front of the line." Reed scoffed and walked away, muttering about her attitude. Chloe rolled her eyes. "Don't mind him. He's just mad that powerful man asked for Dr. Carter instead of him." But Isabel was no longer listening. Her gaze was drawn to the end of the hall, where Park Jin-woo stood, watching her. He hadn't followed his boss. He was observing her, his expression impossible to read. It was a cold, calculating look, and it sent a shiver down her spine. She had done more than just stand up to a powerful man. She had gotten his attention. She had become an unexpected problem in his perfectly controlled world. An hour later, Isabel found herself standing outside the door to the hospital's most exclusive suite on the top floor. It was a world away from the noise of the ER. Here, the floors were polished marble and the lighting was soft. Dr. Carter had personally requested her for this duty, a decision that felt less like a compliment and more like a punishment. "He asked for you," was all Dr. Carter had said, his eyes giving her a silent warning. "Be careful, Isabel." She pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The room was bigger than her entire apartment, with a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows showing a glittering view of the city. Kang Dae-hyun was on the bed, his injured arm now professionally stitched and bandaged. He was shirtless, and his muscular torso was a map of a violent life. Old, thin white scars crisscrossed his skin, telling a story of countless battles. He wasn't looking at the city. He was looking at her. His stormy gray eyes followed her every move as she crossed the room to check his vital signs. The silence was thick and heavy with unspoken tension. It was more unnerving than his shouting had been. She worked with a detached professionalism, her hands steady as she checked his pulse, her gaze fixed on the medical monitor. She could feel his eyes on her, a physical weight, an intense gaze that seemed to be trying to figure her out. She refused to give him the satisfaction of looking away or showing any fear. This was her workplace. Here, she was the expert. "Your blood pressure is a little high, Mr. Kang," she stated, her voice calm and clinical. "That's to be expected after an injury." He said nothing. He simply watched. He watched the way her fingers adjusted the foredrip. He watched the slight frown of concentration between her brows. He watched the way she moved with a grace and purpose that seemed out of place in the sterile room. For Isabel, the silence was a battlefield. She had spent her life standing up to bullies, to men who used their power and their voices like weapons. It was a reflex born from a difficult childhood, a promise she'd made to a younger, more helpless version of herself. She would never again let a man's anger make her feel small. But this man's silence was a different kind of weapon. It was a void that threatened to pull her in. In the quiet of the room, she found herself truly seeing him for the first time, not as an arrogant mafia boss, but as a patient. She saw the tightness in his jaw and the faint sweat on his brow that spoke of a pain he refused to show. Beneath the layers of muscle and menace, there was a wounded man. And the healer in her, the part of her that was stronger than the warrior, felt an unwelcome stir of sympathy. The silent standoff continued for 2 days. Isabel would come for her shifts, perform her duties with perfect care, and speak only when it was medically necessary. Dae-hyun would watch, his gaze a constant, unnerving presence. Park Jin-woo was a permanent fixture outside the door, a silent guardian who seemed to never leave his post. Dr. Reed made another attempt to have her taken off the case, but he was mysteriously shut down by the hospital board themselves. A memo was sent out stating that Mr. King's care was to be handled only by Nurse Rossi and Dr. Carter, with no exceptions. The invisible strings of the mafia boss's power were being pulled, rearranging the hospital's rules to suit him. Isabel felt like she was being studied under a microscope. She hated the feeling of being watched, of being singled out. It was on the third night that something finally changed. She entered his room near midnight to change the dressing on his wound. The city lights glittered below like a sea of stars. Daehyun was asleep, a rare sight. In sleep, the hard lines of his face softened. The ruthless control was gone, replaced by a deep exhaustion. He looked younger, almost vulnerable. As she gently began to unwrap the bandage, he flinched, a tremor running through his body. A single word escaped his lips, a pained whisper in Korean. "Maenhee, I'm sorry." His brow furrowed in pain, and his breathing hitched. He was caught in a nightmare, his hands clenching the sheets. He was no longer the intimidating Korean mafia boss. He was a man trapped in his own private hell. Isabel's training took over, but her response was more than just professional. On instinct, she placed a gentle hand on his uninjured shoulder. "Mr. Kang," she said softly. "Daehyun, you're safe. You're in the hospital," her low, steady voice seemed to cut through the darkness of his dream. His eyes shot open. They were wild and confused, filled with a raw, unguarded pain she had never seen before. He stared at her, then at her hand on his shoulder. In an instant, the vulnerability vanished, replaced by a flash of fury. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at himself, furious that she had witnessed that moment of weakness. He sat up abruptly, hissing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Get out," he rasped, his voice raw and brittle. He refused to look at her, staring instead at the window with his jaw clenched tight. She had seen behind the monster's mask, and he couldn't stand it. Without a word, she gathered her supplies and walked out. The image of his broken expression burned into her mind. The wall between them hadn't just cracked, it had been shattered. The next morning, the air in the suite was different. The tension was still there, but it was no longer a Cold War. It was something fragile and exposed. Daehyun was awake when she entered, sitting in a chair by the window, already dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and black pants that had been delivered by Jinwoo. He didn't acknowledge her, but he didn't order her out, either. She went about her morning checks, the silence stretching between them. She was updating his chart at a small desk when Park Jinwoo entered, silent as a ghost. He walked directly to Isabel. He placed a heavy, insulated bag on the corner of her desk. "For you," he said, his voice a low monotone. Isabel looked from the bag to his emotionless face. "I don't understand, a gift," Jinwoo stated. From Mr. Kang, Isabel's eyes flickered to Daehyun, whose back was still to them. A surge of anger rose in her. A gift? After last night? Was this an apology? A bribe? An attempt to erase the moment of weakness she had witnessed? She couldn't accept it. It felt like a way for him to reestablish his power, to turn a human moment into something that could be bought and paid for. "Thank you, but I can't accept this," she said firmly, pushing the bag back toward him. Jinwoo's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to grow colder. "It is not a request, and my refusal is not up for discussion," Isabel countered, lifting her chin. "I am his nurse. I don't accept gifts from patients," a muscle ticked in Jinwoo's jaw. He seemed to be considering his options, a man clearly not used to being told no. Finally, he spoke, his words chosen carefully. "Mr. Kang does not like to be in debt to anyone. You showed him a kindness. This is a balancing of the scale, a balancing of the scale." The phrase chilled her. He was talking about last night, about her simple act of comfort. The mafia boss was trying to erase it, to cancel the debt of a human connection. She looked over at Daehyun again. He had turned his head slightly, and his stormy gray eyes met hers in the reflection of the window. There was no warmth in them, but there was something else. It wasn't just a gift. It was an offering. A silent, clumsy acknowledgement from a man who only knew how to communicate through power and payment. With a sigh, she pulled the bag back toward her. "Fine," she said, not to Jinwoo, but to the reflection in the glass. "I will accept it." This time, Jinwoo gave a small nod and left as silently as he had arrived. Later, in the quiet of the nurse's break room, Isabel finally opened the bag. It wasn't jewelry or money. Inside was a collection of perfectly arranged food containers. The aroma that came out was warm and deeply familiar, a rich, fragrant smell of home-cooked food. It was a classic Italian pasta dish with a rich tomato sauce, just like her grandmother used to make. It was a taste of a home she hadn't known in years. Tucked into the side was a small thermos of hot, sweet chamomile tea, the kind she always drank on her break, a detail so small she couldn't imagine how he would have known. He had been watching her, not just as an object of his anger, but as a person. The realization was deeply unsettling. This wasn't a business transaction, it was a personal observation. When she returned to his room for his evening checkup, he was by the window, but he turned as she entered. "Was the food to your liking?" he asked, his voice low. It was the first real question he had asked her. It was, she admitted, her voice softer than she intended. "How did you know?" A small, genuine smile touched his lips. "I pay attention to things that interest me, Nurse Rossi." The title was still formal, but the way he said it was different. "My name is Isabel," she found herself saying. "And my name is Daehyun," he replied. They stood there for a long moment, the space between them charged with a new, fragile understanding. "Why are you a nurse, Isabel?" he asked, his gaze intense. She hesitated, the old protective walls threatening to rise again. But his own vulnerability from the night before echoed in her memory. "Because when I was young," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "I saw what happens when there is no one strong enough to stand up for people who are hurting. I decided I would be that person." She didn't speak of the shouting, of the slamming doors, of a father whose anger was a destructive force. But he heard it anyway. She could see it in his eyes, a flicker of dark recognition. He understood that kind of pain. Just then, Dr. Reed entered without knocking, a sneer already on his face. "Rossi, I need you in triage. We have a real patient who needs your help." He pointedly ignored Daehyun. Before Isabel could respond, Daehyun's voice cut through the air, quiet as a whisper, but 100 times colder. "Dr. Reed, you will address Nurse Rossi with respect. And you will knock before you enter my room again." Reed turned pale, stammering an apology as he quickly backed out of the room. The display of power was absolute, a quiet, deadly threat. Isabel stood frozen, her heart pounding. The most powerful mafia boss in the city had defended her. It was a strange, dizzying mix of fear at what he was capable of and a deeply undeniable thrill. Daehyun was discharged 2 days later. The top floor of the hospital returned to normal, but for Isabel, the entire building felt empty. The silence in the hallways was no longer peaceful. It was a void where a dangerous, magnetic presence used to be. She threw herself into her work, but his shadow lingered. Chloe noticed the change immediately. "You miss him," she stated bluntly over lunch. "I do not," Isabel retorted, a little too quickly. "I miss the peace and quiet, liar." "You miss the scary, handsome mafia boss who made Dr. Reed practically run away in fear." Isabel couldn't help but smile. That was satisfying. Her shift ended late that night. Exhausted, she walked through the nearly empty parking garage. As she approached her car, she saw something tucked under the windshield wiper. It was a single, perfect white gardenia, its petals flawless. There was no note. There didn't need to be one. It was a message. "I am still watching." The next day, Dr. Carter called her into his office. "Isabel," he began, his expression serious. "I've been at this hospital a long time. I've seen men like Kang Daehyun before. They live in a different world with different rules. A world that can be very dangerous for people like us. Be careful. A man like that doesn't make gestures without a purpose. He's either claiming something or marking it as his." His words sent a chill down her spine. Later that afternoon, as she was leaving, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. Park Jin-woo was at the wheel. "Mr. Kang requests your presence," he said. It wasn't a question. Everything inside Isabel screamed at her to refuse, to walk away and never look back. But the memory of Daehyun's haunted eyes, the unexpected taste of home, the silent offering of a single white flower, they pulled at her with an irresistible force. She got in the car. The decision felt less like a choice and more like fate, a step onto a path from which there was no turning back. The car moved through the city, pulling into the underground garage of a glittering skyscraper that touched the clouds. The penthouse was a world of glass and steel with breathtaking views. It was a beautiful cage. Daehyun was standing by the windows, looking down at the city he owned. He turned as she entered. "Thank you for coming," he said. You didn't give me much of a choice, he nodded, accepting the truth in her words. I have grown, accustomed to your presence. His honesty was disarming. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. I am in an unfamiliar position, Isabel. I don't know the rules for this. There are no rules for this. Daehyun, as she spoke, the building vibrated. A sudden, violent explosion shattered the wall of windows behind him. The sound was a physical blow, throwing them both to the floor as glass rained down. Alarms blared. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard shouting in Russian. Men in tactical gear were smashing through the remaining windows. This was a targeted, military-style assault. Before she could process the terror, Daehyun was on his feet, pulling her up with him. His face was a mask of cold fury, the vulnerable man gone, replaced entirely by the monster, the mafia boss he was known to be. Jin-woo, he roared, and his right-hand man was already there, tossing him a pistol. The fight was a blur of brutal, deadly violence. Daehyun moved with a terrifying speed and precision. Isabel, hidden behind a thick marble column, watched in horrified awe as the man who had nightmares and a soft spot for chamomile tea became a whirlwind of death, protecting her, shielding her with his own body. The firefight was over in less than a minute. The attackers lay still. Silence returned, broken only by the wail of distant sirens. Daehyun stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily. His eyes found hers, and in them, she saw not victory, but deep regret. He had wanted to keep her separate from this world, and he had failed. He crossed the glass-strewn floor to her. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs gently wiping away dust from her cheeks. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice a low, urgent rasp. She could only shake her head, her eyes wide as she took in the devastation. He saw the fear in her eyes, and something inside him broke. This is what I am, Isabel, he said, his voice raw with pain. This violence. This is the world I rule. He was giving her an out, showing her the ugliest part of himself, expecting her to run. But as she looked at him, she didn't just see the monster. She saw the man who had flinched in his sleep. The man who had remembered her favorite tea. The man who had just put his body between her and a hail of bullets. She reached up and her fingers gently touched a new cut on his cheek. He flinched from the tenderness of the gesture. Let me see, she murmured, her nurse's voice calm and steady. She led him into a vast, marble bathroom, ignoring the dead men in the other room. She found a first aid kit, her hands moving with purpose as she cleaned the wound. When she finished, her hands lingered on his jaw. You asked me why I became a nurse, she said softly. I told you I wanted to be the person who stands up for people who are hurting. She looked directly into his stormy eyes. You're hurting, Daehyun, the truth hung between them. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. My father was like the men in that room, he whispered, the confession torn from a deep, hidden place. He taught me this life. He forged me into this weapon. I was 16 when I finally stood up to him. To protect my mother, his story was not one of choice, but of survival. He was a monster created by the very world he now ruled. And in his story, Isabel heard an echo of her own. Different pasts, different scars, but the same defiant spirit born from pain. You are not your father, she said fiercely. He pulled back to look at her, his expression shattered and hopeful. And then he kissed her. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, a collision of two worlds, of darkness and light. And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, Isabel didn't run. She kissed him back. 6 months later, Isabel left Mercy General after a long shift. A familiar black sedan was waiting at the curb. Jin-woo stood by the passenger door, and he gave her a respectful nod as he opened it for her. The gesture was no longer unnerving. It had become a quiet, comforting part of her life. The car didn't take her to her old apartment. It took her to the skyscraper, to the penthouse that had been restored, the wall of windows now made of bulletproof glass. When she stepped inside, the lights were low, and the smell of a familiar tomato sauce filled the air. Daehyun was in the kitchen, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to recreate her grandmother's pasta recipe. He looked up as she entered, and the guarded, intimidating mask he wore for the world dissolved, replaced by a smile that was just for her. I'm not sure I got the spices right, he said, a warmth in his voice she had come to cherish. She walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind and resting her head against his strong back. "It smells perfect," he turned in her embrace, his hands finding hers. His world was still there, a dark and dangerous reality. But his actions were no longer driven by a need for power, but by a fierce, unwavering need to protect the new center of his universe. To protect her. Isabel hadn't abandoned her world, either. She was still Nurse Rossi at Mercy General, a beacon of calm in the chaos. But her life was bigger now, her heart fuller. "Stay with me tonight," he murmured against her hair. "This is our home," he corrected her gently. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss full of promises kept and a future they were building together. They were an impossible paradox, the healer and the Korean mafia boss, the light and the shadow. But here, in their castle in the sky, they had found their own kind of peace, a defiant, unbreakable love forged in the heart of a storm.